He was supposed to be a hero in his son's eyes, but instead, he became a source of embarrassment. Every failed promise, every harsh word, every mistake piled up like an invisible wall between them. Today, you'll see how pride, regret, and one father's stubbornness shattered a bond that could never be repaired until one moment changed everything. Stay with me, because what happens next could make you question your own family relationships. Chapter 1: The Perfect Image. Daniel Parker always thought his father, Robert, was a man who could do anything. In his young eyes, Robert was brave, strong, and wise. Daniel's friends would tell stories about their fathers, and he would proudly say, "My dad can fix anything. He knows everything." Every night, he would watch Robert walk through the door after work, imagining that he carried the world on his shoulders. In Daniel's mind, his father was perfect. But perfection is a fragile illusion. Robert Parker had always struggled quietly. He carried debts, unfinished projects, and personal failures that Daniel never saw. He was a man of pride, but pride often made him stubborn. Even small mistakes weighed heavily on him. He hid these struggles because he wanted to appear strong, not just to his son, but to himself. The cracks in their relationship began subtly. One evening, Daniel asked Robert to help with a school science project. Robert was tired and distracted, and he accidentally broke the model Daniel had been working on for weeks. Daniel's heart sank. "It's okay, Dad," he said quickly, forcing a smile, but the disappointment was clear in his eyes. Robert saw it too, but didn't know how to respond. The next morning, Daniel walked to school with the broken project in his backpack, imagining his friends' reactions. He felt an unfamiliar stir of shame. A small seed had been planted, one that would quietly grow over the years. Robert noticed Daniel's quietness, but assumed he was just tired or upset about school. Neither realized that this was the beginning of a subtle but growing distance between father and son. By the end of the week, small misunderstandings had added up. Daniel wanted to share his dreams and ambitions, but Robert's pride and fear of failure kept him distant. They spoke less and less about real feelings. Daniel still idolized his father in some ways, but the first tiny cracks in the perfect image were forming, cracks that would soon grow wider than either of them could imagine. Chapter 2: First Signs of Shame. Daniel's first real taste of embarrassment came sooner than he expected. It was the annual school talent show, and he had promised his mother he would help organize the decorations. Daniel asked his father to assist, imagining that they could do it together as a team. Robert agreed, but as always, he underestimated the effort. He spilled paint on the stage floor and knocked over a stand of balloons. Teachers rushed over to fix the mess, and Daniel could feel the eyes of his classmates on him. "Dad!" Daniel whispered, but the words were weak. His pride burned hotter than his embarrassment. His friends snickered quietly in the back, not wanting to seem rude but unable to hide their amusement. Daniel felt a knot in his stomach. For the first time, he began to see his father not as the hero he imagined, but as a man who could falter, publicly and sometimes painfully. At home that evening, Daniel's mother, Susan, tried to console him. "It's not a big deal, honey. Your dad was just trying to help." But Daniel couldn't shake the memory of all the eyes on him at school, all the silent judgment he imagined. That night, he lay in bed thinking about his father, confused. How could the man he admired so much embarrass him in front of everyone? Meanwhile, Robert noticed Daniel's quiet mood, but couldn't understand its cause. To him, a small mistake was nothing worth discussing.
He believed life's lessons came from action, not apology. But Daniel's mind was changing. Pride, shame, and the fear of being judged had started to grow in his heart. From that moment on, Daniel's admiration began to mix with a painful, uncomfortable feeling, a feeling he would later call shame. These early experiences planted a seed that would influence every interaction between father and son in the years to come. Small mistakes, ignored feelings, and public embarrassment had created a gap, and neither Daniel nor Robert yet realized just how wide that gap would grow.
Chapter 3. Words that Wound. The tension between Daniel and Robert began to grow more visible as Daniel entered his teenage years. One Sunday morning, Daniel was helping his father clean the garage, a task he secretly enjoyed because he liked working alongside Robert. But Robert's patience was short that day. When Daniel accidentally dropped a box of old tools, Robert snapped. "Can't you do anything right?" he barked, his voice sharp enough to echo through the house. Daniel froze. The words cut deeper than any failure. It wasn't just the criticism, it was the public tone, the sense of being small in his father's eyes. Daniel wanted to defend himself, to explain that it was an accident, but he knew arguing would only make things worse. So he stayed silent, pretending nothing had happened, but inside a storm was growing. He began to notice a pattern. Every minor mistake, every misstep was met with harsh words or visible disappointment. He was learning that his father's pride often outweighed his love. At school, Daniel's friends began to notice the change in him. He was quieter, less confident, more cautious around others. When someone mentioned their father's achievements or skills, Daniel would smile faintly but feel a pang of shame. The man he once idolized now seemed capable of humiliation, and the embarrassment he felt at home followed him like a shadow. Robert, meanwhile, didn't understand the effect of his words. He thought discipline and correction were ways to teach responsibility. He believed his son needed to learn life's lessons, even if it hurt a little. What he failed to see was that harsh words, repeated over time, were leaving invisible scars, shaping Daniel's feelings of inadequacy and shame. By the end of the chapter, their home had become quiet, filled with the tension of unspoken resentment. Daniel avoided conversations, and Robert grew frustrated at what he saw as disrespect and distance. Both were trapped in a cycle neither fully understood, and the walls between father and son were beginning to feel permanent. Chapter 4. The Secret Struggle. While Daniel wrestled with embarrassment and growing resentment, Robert carried a private burden. No one knew that he had been struggling at work, facing financial problems and a fear of failure he couldn't share. His pride prevented him from asking for help, and he often acted impatient or distant to mask his insecurities. Daniel noticed his father's quiet moments, the way he sighed in the evenings or stared blankly at the bills on the kitchen table, but he misinterpreted it. "He's just weak," Daniel thought. "He's nothing like the dad I imagined." He didn't know about Robert's sacrifices or the nights he stayed awake worrying about the future of their family. One evening, Daniel tried to ask his father about his mood, but Robert brushed him off. "I'm fine, Daniel. Don't worry about it," he said, his voice firm. Daniel felt rejected and invisible. He began to retreat further, keeping his thoughts and feelings to himself, believing his father could never understand. The distance grew, and small misunderstandings turned into daily friction. Daniel's silence was met with Robert's strictness, while Robert's pride was met with Daniel's quiet shame. They lived under the same roof, but felt like strangers,
each judging the other silently. This chapter shows the hidden struggles that can shape behavior without anyone realizing it. Robert's pride and fear, Daniel's shame and misunderstanding, they both carried invisible weights that pushed them apart. The tragedy wasn't just embarrassment, it was the lack of understanding, the failure to see what lay beneath the surface of actions and words. By the end of this chapter, both father and son are standing on the edge of a growing chasm. Neither has realized it yet, but the choices they make in the coming years will define whether the bond can survive or crumble entirely.
Chapter 5. A Shattered Moment. It happened on a warm Saturday afternoon. Daniel had invited a few of his close friends over to celebrate a small school achievement. He had planned everything meticulously: snacks on the table, games in the backyard, and even a small cake. He wanted this day to be perfect, a memory he could proudly share with his friends. But Robert, unaware of the plan's importance, decided to join the preparations. He meant well, he wanted to help, but his timing and actions were clumsy. While moving the table, he accidentally spilled the punch all over the freshly cleaned floor. Daniel's heart sank. His friends froze, unsure of how to react. Laughter, not entirely malicious, echoed from the backyard. Daniel felt heat rush to his face, a mix of shame and anger. "Dad, be careful!" Daniel shouted, his voice sharper than he intended. Robert turned, surprised by the intensity. "I'm just helping, Daniel. You don't need to treat me like a child," he said defensively. But Daniel didn't hear the intention. He only heard the embarrassment, magnified in front of his friends. That evening, after the party, Daniel confronted his father. "Why do you always have to mess everything up? Why can't you just act normal for once?" His words were harsh, filled with months of bottled-up frustration. Robert felt wounded. He had tried to help, but his son's words felt like betrayal. "I'm your father, Daniel. Do you think I do this on purpose?" he yelled back. For the first time, Daniel saw his father's anger, but it didn't erase the humiliation he felt. That day marked a turning point. Their bond, fragile until then, fractured visibly. Daniel's admiration for his father had been replaced by a complicated mix of resentment and shame, while Robert's pride hardened further. Neither knew how to bridge the growing gap, and both began retreating into silence. By the end of the chapter, the family home felt colder. Daniel avoided asking for help, fearing embarrassment. Robert avoided genuine conversation, fearing criticism. The simple mistakes of everyday life had escalated into emotional walls neither knew how to dismantle. Chapter 6. Life Lessons Ignored. Robert believed that teaching Daniel lessons through strict discipline was necessary for life. He had grown up in a household where showing emotion was seen as weakness. So when Daniel made small mistakes, forgetting chores, misplacing homework, Robert often responded with anger, lectures, or sarcasm. He thought he was shaping a strong young man, but Daniel experienced it as rejection. One afternoon, Daniel returned home with a poor grade in math. Instead of discussing how to improve, Robert scolded him in front of his sister and neighbors, who had dropped by unexpectedly. Daniel felt crushed. Why does he always have to make me feel small, he wondered. The humiliation wasn't about the grade, it was about feeling unseen and misunderstood. At the same time, Robert wrestled with guilt he could never express. He knew that he wanted to be a good father, but pride and habit prevented him from showing tenderness or apology. Every harsh word he said was meant to teach, but all it did was push Daniel further away.
Daniel's resentment grew quietly. He began to distance himself emotionally, avoiding meaningful conversations. Small gestures of care from Robert, fixing a bike, helping with homework, went unnoticed, overshadowed by the larger pattern of criticism. Daniel's perception of his father was becoming fixed, a man of pride, a man who embarrassed him, a man he could not trust with his feelings. By the end of the chapter, the relationship had become a pattern. Robert's lessons ignored, Daniel's emotions suppressed. Both carried their burdens silently, each thinking the other was at fault. And the distance between father and son, invisible yet vast, became the central tension that would define the story for years to come. Chapter 7: The Turning Point. The turning point came unexpectedly. One winter evening, Robert returned home from work looking unusually pale and tired. He dismissed it at first, saying he was just exhausted. But when he collapsed while climbing the stairs, Daniel and his mother rushed him to the hospital. The doctors confirmed it. Robert had a serious heart condition that required immediate attention. Seeing his father so vulnerable for the first time shook Daniel deeply. He had never imagined that the strong, sometimes intimidating man he saw daily could be fragile, even mortal. Sitting in the hospital room, watching his father struggle with fear and pain, Daniel felt emotions he had long buried: fear, concern, and even guilt for all the resentment he had held. Robert, lying in the sterile hospital bed, realized how his pride had shaped their relationship. He thought of all the harsh words, all the times he embarrassed his son, all the lessons he had enforced without love. For the first time, he saw his failures clearly, not as abstract mistakes, but as actions that had hurt the one person he loved most. During those long nights in the hospital, father and son shared quiet moments. They didn't speak much at first, but their presence spoke volumes. Daniel held his father's hand, and Robert, surprisingly, allowed himself to lean on his son. It was a role reversal neither expected, and it humbled them both. By the end of this chapter, both men began to understand that the walls they had built over the years could start to crumble, not through arguments or discipline, but through vulnerability. The turning point wasn't a grand apology or revelation, it was a shared human experience that neither could ignore. Chapter 8: Regret and Reflection. After Robert's recovery, the atmosphere at home changed subtly but meaningfully. He spent quiet evenings reflecting on the past. He thought about every moment he had scolded Daniel, every instance he had acted out of pride instead of love. The weight of regret pressed heavily on his shoulders, but for the first time, he wanted to make amends. Daniel, meanwhile, wrestled with conflicting emotions. He remembered years of humiliation, anger, and embarrassment, but he also saw his father's vulnerability and his attempts to improve. He began to question whether holding on to resentment was fair, not just to his father, but to himself. One evening, Daniel approached Robert in the kitchen. "Dad, I know you didn't mean to hurt me all those times. Maybe we both could have done things differently," he said carefully. Robert looked at his son, eyes misty, and nodded. "I was too proud to see what mattered," he admitted. It was a simple sentence, but it carried years of unspoken regret. They began small acts of reconciliation. Robert asked for Daniel's advice on simple tasks, listened more than he lectured, and occasionally shared stories about his own mistakes. Daniel responded with patience, allowing himself to be more open and forgiving. The first bridges were fragile, but they were real. By the end of this chapter, the father and son were not yet fully healed, but hope existed. Regret had become a teacher, and reflection had opened doors to understanding. Both learned that relationships aren't fixed by perfection, they're repaired through humility, empathy, and small, consistent actions.
Chapter 9. A Fragile Bridge. The months following Robert's recovery were slow but meaningful. Father and son cautiously tested the waters of a new relationship. Daniel began sharing small details about his life, school struggles, friends, and even dreams for the future. Robert listened without judgment, sometimes offering advice, but mostly just hearing his son for the first time. One afternoon, Daniel invited Robert to help him build a small treehouse in the backyard. This time, mistakes were allowed, laughter replaced tension, and silence was comfortable rather than cold. Robert realized that the joy of simply being present with his son was more important than teaching lessons or enforcing discipline. Daniel also noticed subtle changes in his father. Robert smiled more easily, admitted when he didn't know something, and even shared stories of his own embarrassing moments. The son who had once felt ashamed now saw a human side of his father he had never recognized before. A man who was imperfect but genuine, courageous enough to admit flaws. They began sharing conversations that were honest and gentle. Apologies were exchanged quietly, and forgiveness slowly took root. The fragile bridge between them was forming, built not on grand gestures, but on consistency, patience, and understanding. Each small act became a brick, creating a path back toward connection. By the end of this chapter, Daniel and Robert were cautiously optimistic. The past couldn't be erased, but it no longer dictated every interaction. They had learned that rebuilding trust required humility and openness, and that the strongest bonds often emerge from vulnerability. Chapter 10. Pride, Love, and Forgiveness. The final chapter of their story didn't end in perfection, but in acceptance. Robert finally admitted the full weight of his mistakes, telling Daniel, "I was proud, too proud, and I let that pride hurt the person I love most." Daniel, in turn, acknowledged his own stubbornness and judgment. "I was ashamed, Dad, but I also never stopped caring. I wanted us to understand each other." They forgave each other, not as a magical solution, but as a deliberate choice. Daniel learned that shame and love could coexist, that people could fail and still deserve compassion. Robert understood that pride could never substitute for empathy, and that humility was the foundation of a lasting bond. Together, they celebrated small victories, shared meals, quiet evenings, and moments of laughter that weren't shadowed by past mistakes. Their relationship was not perfect, but it was real, grounded in honesty and understanding. Both had grown, Daniel more compassionate, Robert more self-aware, and the gap that once seemed impossible to cross had become a bridge, fragile yet strong enough to walk on. The story ends with a bittersweet note. Love and pride, shame and forgiveness can coexist. Life will always bring mistakes and regrets, but the choice to rebuild, to forgive, and to embrace vulnerability determines whether bonds survive. This story isn't just about one father and one son, it's about every relationship broken by pride, every word said in anger, every opportunity to love that we let slip. Shame can blind us to the humanity of those closest to us. Regret can haunt us if we wait too long to apologize. And forgiveness is never easy, but it's always powerful. Today, look at the people around you, your parents, your children, your friends, and ask yourself, are you building walls with pride or bridges with love? The choice is yours. Don't wait for tragedy to teach you what you can act on now. Reach out, speak, and forgive before it's too late.